All right, everybody, welcome in. Today we're tackling a really stimulating but maybe kind of dense read. John David Garcia's The Moral Society.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but worth it.
He's basically arguing that humanity might be heading for a pretty disastrous ending, like we might actually self-destruct.
Right, like he's really laying out this kind of like stark warning about the path we're on.
But here's the thing: it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah, Garcia's not just going to leave us hanging with that, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
He also gives us this blueprint, this vision for like a brighter future, which he calls the moral society. So are you ready to unpack this thing?
Absolutely. And I think what makes Garcia so compelling is that he doesn't just point out the problems, like he offers a detailed alternative.
Right. It's not just a criticism. It's like, okay, if we're doing all this stuff wrong, then how do we actually do it right?
Exactly. And that's where this idea of the moral society comes, in a society built on awareness, education, and ethical decision-making.
Okay, so it's not just about being like a good person. It's about building a whole new system, right?
Precisely. And it starts with this idea of shifting our focus. See, Garcia, he compares life to a game. He calls our current way of operating the game of pleasure. We're constantly chasing after the newest gadgets, the latest trends, always seeking that next hit of dopamine.
It's so true, though. Like, how many times have you gotten the newest phone and then, like, a week later, it's already old news?
Right, it's this constant cycle of instant gratification, but it never really satisfies. And that's the problem, according to Garcia. He argues that this relentless pursuit of pleasure ultimately leads to a decline in awareness.
Like, we become so focused on those quick hits of dopamine that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And he calls that decline entropy.
Entropy. That's a pretty heavy word. What's that, like, from physics or something?
Yeah, it basically means a state of disorder or chaos. Think of it like a messy room. If you don't actively put things back in order, it naturally descends into chaos.
Okay, I get it. So Garcia is saying that without a conscious effort to grow and learn, to expand our awareness, our lives and our societies naturally tend towards this state of entropy.
Precisely. And eventually it leads to self-destruction. He draws parallels to past civilizations, the Roman Empire, the Mayan societies that collapsed under their own weight because they lost sight of the bigger picture.
Wow, kind of makes you think about those crumbling empires from history class, huh?
And Garcia would argue we're seeing echoes of that today, especially when you look at his concerns about over-specialization and bureaucracy.
Right. He's pretty critical of those things, which is interesting, right? Because, like, our world is all about specialization.
Yeah.
You got to find your niche, become an expert in one very specific thing.
Exactly. And to be fair, Garcia acknowledges that specialization can be beneficial. Like, we need heart surgeons and software engineers, right? But he argues that taking it too far actually limits our perspectives.
It's like that saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right. That's a great way to put it. Garcia believes that a broad foundation of knowledge is essential, even if you eventually specialize.
So it's more about becoming like a well-rounded individual first and then specializing. That's an interesting take. But he doesn't just stop at specialization, he also goes after bureaucracy. Why is that?
Well, Garcia believes that bureaucracies, while sometimes necessary, they have this tendency to become more concerned with maintaining themselves than with actually serving people or pursuing, the greater good.
So it's like they become these self-perpetuating machines that are more interested in following the rules than in achieving real progress.
Exactly. Think about, like, anytime you've had to deal with a large organization, like those times you get stuck in those automated phone menus.
Ugh, the worst. Press 1 for.
Or you're getting bounced around between different departments. Nobody seems to know what's going on.
And you end up feeling like just a number in the system, right? Like your individual needs or concerns just don't matter.
Right, and that's exactly what Garcia is getting at. He argues that those frustrating experiences are actually symptoms of a much deeper problem within these large organizations. It's a sign that they've become more focused on self-preservation than on actually fulfilling their purpose.
Which, I mean, that's a pretty bleak way to look at it.
Yeah.
But it's hard to argue with those everyday experiences, right? Like, we've all been there.
Exactly. And the scary part is that, according to Garcia, this stagnation, this focus on just maintaining the status quo, it can ultimately lead to corruption and decline. He uses examples of governments, education systems, even the military, to illustrate how bureaucracy stifles feedback and innovation, and ultimately it breeds this sense of, like, complacency and decay.
Yeah, it's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there. If organizations are constantly looking backward, they're not going to be prepared for the challenges of the future, right?
Absolutely. And that's a key theme for Garcia. He's really concerned with how we adapt and evolve as individuals and as a society. He argues that we need to be constantly questioning, challenging the status quo, and seeking new and better ways of doing things.
And that's where his critique of ideology comes in, right? Because
Yeah.
he sees ideology as another one of those things that can really hold us back.
He does. Garcia is very, very clear that he sees all ideologies as inherently flawed.
All ideologies. So we're talking like political ideologies, religious ideologies, even like personal belief systems.
Yep, pretty much any system of thought that claims to have all the answers. He argues that they offer this kind of comforting illusion, this sense of certainty, but it comes at a cost, right?
It's like that feeling of belonging to a group or a tribe, but it can also make you blind to other perspectives.
That's it exactly. Garcia would say that clinging too tightly to any one ideology, it blinds you to other possibilities. It prevents you from truly engaging with complexity and nuance.
So it's not about saying that all ideologies are inherently bad, but rather that any ideology, if it's not like constantly being questioned and challenged, it can become this kind of dogma.
Exactly. And Garcia, he offers a really compelling example with the debate about intelligence.
Oh yeah, that's a hot button issue for sure.
It is. And while Garcia personally believes that genetics play a significant role in intelligence.
So he's kind of leaning towards the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate there.
Right. But here's the important part. Even though he personally leans in that direction, he criticizes both sides of the argument, both the nature people and the nurture people.
So he's not just picking a side and sticking to it blindly. He's actually engaging with the complexity of the issue.
Exactly. He criticizes both sides for being more interested in pushing their own agendas than in actually having a nuanced, scientifically grounded discussion.
So it's more about dogma than genuine exploration, and for him, that's a big problem.
A huge problem. And it highlights a key theme for Garcia: the danger of clinging to any belief system too rigidly. He wants us to be able to engage with different perspectives, even those that make us uncomfortable. He argues that this kind of open-mindedness is essential for growth and awareness.
So if specialization and rigid ideologies are leading us down this potentially dangerous path, what does he propose as the alternative? This is where the ethical state comes in, right?
That's exactly right. It's Garcia's answer to the question, okay, if we're doing all this stuff wrong, then how do we actually do it right?
It's like he's not just talking philosophy anymore. He's actually designing a whole new world order based on these principles of awareness and ethical decision-making.
That's a great way to put it. The ethical state is Garcia's vision for a society that is intentionally designed to promote growth, awareness, and the well-being of all its members.
So it sounds like a pretty radical departure from how we do things now. Like he's not just talking about tweaking the system around the edges. He's talking about a fundamental transformation.
Absolutely. He's challenging us to rethink everything from how we educate our children to how we structure our governments, and it all hinges on this idea of what he calls ethical behavior.
Okay, so we're getting into the heart of Garcia's philosophy here. What does he actually mean by ethical?
That's a great question, and it's central to his whole argument. See, for Garcia, being ethical isn't about following a rigid set of rules or adhering to some external moral code. It's about making choices that increase awareness.
Increase awareness. So it's about like being more conscious of ourselves, of our actions, and the impact we have on the world around us.
That's a great way to put it. He argues that ethical actions are those that expand our understanding of ourselves, of other people, and of the world as a whole. They're actions that contribute to growth and progress, both for ourselves and for humanity as a whole.
So it's less about adhering to a fixed set of morals and more about constantly striving to learn, to grow, and to make choices that align with that pursuit of knowledge and understanding.
Exactly. It's about aligning our actions with what he calls the game of life, this ongoing pursuit of expanding awareness. And this is where his concept of the ethical state comes in. He believes that in order to fully embrace this way of living, we need a system that is designed to support it.
So the ethical state is like the framework, the infrastructure that allows individuals to thrive and pursue that game of life more effectively.
Precisely. It's about creating a system that encourages and rewards ethical decision-making at every level of society.
Okay, so less about, imposing strict rules from the top down, and more about creating an environment where people are empowered to make choices that are both beneficial to themselves and to the greater good.
That's a great way to put it. It's about fostering a culture of awareness, where individuals are encouraged to think critically, question assumptions, and constantly strive for a deeper understanding of the world around them.
And this is where his critique of traditional power structures really comes into play, right? Because those traditional structures, they often seem to stifle innovation and critical thinking rather than promote them.
Absolutely. And Garcia is not afraid to challenge the status quo. He believes that the current way we do things, the way we educate our children, the way we structure our governments, even the way we think about leadership, it's all designed to maintain the existing power structures, which often prioritize the game of pleasure over the game of life.
So he's calling for a pretty radical overhaul of, well, pretty much everything. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how we think about ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how we organize society as a whole.
Exactly. And he's not just talking about vague ideals either. Garcia actually outlines a detailed blueprint for how this ethical state would function, and it's surprisingly comprehensive. He tackles everything from education to economics to the role of technology in this new world order.
Okay, so let's start breaking down these radical ideas. He starts with the foundation of this ethical state, education. And he's not just talking about adding a few new classes to the curriculum. He's envisioning a total transformation of the system, right?
He is. He believes that the current education system is fundamentally flawed, that it's designed to create obedient workers rather than free-thinking, aware individuals. And his proposed alternative is, well, it's pretty revolutionary.
Okay, so no more standardized tests and rote memorization. That's probably a relief to a lot of our listeners.
Not exactly. Garcia believes that assessment is important, but he argues that it shouldn't be about memorizing facts or conforming to a narrow set of standards. For him, education is all about fostering critical thinking, creativity, and a deep love of learning.
So it's less about cramming information into students' heads and more about teaching them how to think for themselves, how to be adaptable, and how to solve problems.
Exactly. It's about equipping them with the tools they need to thrive in a rapidly changing world. A world where the ability to adapt and learn new things will be more valuable than ever before. And he proposes a really unique way to achieve that. He envisions a system where students are first exposed to a wide range of disciplines, encouraging them to become well-rounded thinkers before diving into any specific field.
He calls this the basic program,
Yeah.
right? It's like laying the foundation for a well-rounded education before specializing. So instead of pushing kids to choose a career path early on, they'd spend their early years exploring a wide range of subjects.
Precisely. Garcia believes that this broad foundation of knowledge is crucial for developing critical thinking skills and adaptability qualities that are becoming increasingly important in our rapidly changing world. He argues that specialization, while important, should come after a solid foundation of general knowledge has been established.
It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation before you can start adding the walls, the roof, and all the finishing touches.
Exactly. And Garcia doesn't stop at curriculum reform. He envisions a complete restructuring of the educational process itself, moving away from the traditional model of passive learning and standardized testing towards a more dynamic, engaging approach.
So we were picturing this ethical state classroom. It's not rows of desks and lectures, right? It's something entirely different.
You got it. He proposes a system of dynamic, competitive teams of educators who are rewarded based on the progress and feedback of their students.
Okay, so imagine a school where teachers are not just evaluated by administrators, but where their success is directly tied to the success of their students. That's a pretty radical departure from the tenure system we see in a lot of places, where job security doesn't always equate to quality of teaching.
Right. And it highlights a key principle in Garcia's thinking. He believes that competition can be a powerful driver of progress.
Even in areas like education that are often seen as, like, off-limits to market forces.
Exactly. Garcia argues that competition, when structured correctly, can breed innovation, accountability, and ultimately better outcomes for everyone involved.
So in this case, it's about creating a system where the best ideas and the most effective teaching methods rise to the top, based on merit and results.
Precisely. He believes this would create an environment where educators are constantly learning, adapting, and improving their craft, ultimately leading to a much higher quality of education for all students. But Garcia's vision for the ethical state, it goes far beyond just overhauling the education system. He argues that achieving true societal transformation, well, it requires a fundamental shift in how we think about leadership.
And this is where his concept of protagonists comes in, right? These aren't just your average everyday leaders. They're more like like philosophical revolutionaries or something.
That's a pretty good way to put it. These aren't just figureheads or politicians. They are individuals who deeply understand and embody the principles of the game of life. They're the ones who will lead the charge in creating this new society.
Okay, so they're not just intellectuals, they're also people of action, right? They're willing to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of actually creating this ethical state. But what makes them different from, say, your typical activist or politician? Because there are a lot of people out there who are fighting for a better world. What sets these protagonists apart?
That's a great question. And Garcia, he acknowledges that there are many well-intentioned people working for positive change, but he argues that traditional methods of activism and political engagement, they often fall short.
So like protesting in the streets, writing to your congressman, that kind of thing. He's saying that's not enough to create real lasting change.
He's not saying it's completely ineffective, but he argues that those methods alone are often not enough to overcome the inertia of deeply entrenched power structures.
Because those power structures, they're designed to resist change, right?
Yeah.
They're designed to maintain the status quo, even if that status quo isn't benefiting everyone.
Exactly. And Garcia, he doesn't believe in waiting for those in power to suddenly have a change of heart or for some mass awakening to happen spontaneously. He argues that real change requires a more proactive, even strategic approach. And that's where the protagonists come in. They need to be willing to work both within and outside the system, using their intelligence, their resources, and their influence to create the conditions for real lasting change. He believes that protagonists, they need to be strategic, even maybe even a little ruthless in their pursuit of a better world.
Ruthless. Okay, so we're not talking about your typical, peace-loving activist here. Garcia's vision is a little bit more intense than that.
Yeah, he's definitely not afraid of shaking things up a bit. He argues that, traditional methods of political activism, they're often just not effective against like really deeply entrenched power structures.
Because those power structures, they don't exactly play fair, right? They're going to use all the tools at their disposal to maintain their grip on power.
Exactly. So Garcia, he's saying that protagonists need to be willing to to fight fire with fire, so to speak. He suggests that that they should use concentrated wealth.
So we're talking about like philanthropists, wealthy donors, people with the financial resources to actually make a dent.
Exactly. And also, like, people in positions of influence, right? People who can leverage their networks and their connections to create change.
So it's not enough to just have good intentions. You need to have the resources and the strategic savvy to actually make a difference.
Right. And Garcia argues that one of the most important things these protagonists can do is to create systems of support for like-minded individuals.
So we're talking about like funding research, creating educational programs, building institutions that promote this kind of ethical decision-making.
Exactly. It's about creating a counterculture, a network of individuals and organizations that are actively working to bring about this ethical state. He sees it as a kind of long game, right? Where these protagonists are laying the groundwork for a fundamental shift in how society operates.
It's a pretty bold vision. I mean, it's one thing to talk about individual transformation, but Garcia's talking about transforming society as a whole.
He is, and he believes it's possible. But he's also realistic about the challenges. He knows it's not going to be easy. There are going to be setbacks, resistance from those in power, and it's going to require a tremendous amount of effort and coordination.
So this is not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not. But Garcia, he believes that the stakes are too high to just sit back and hope for the best. He argues that we're at a critical juncture in human history and that bold action is required if we want to create a better future.
It's a sobering thought, but it's also kind of inspiring in a way. Like, it's a call to action for anyone who's ever felt dissatisfied with the state of the world and wanted to do something about it. But it also makes you wonder, does Garcia actually offer any concrete ideas on how we get from where we are now to this ethical state? Or is it more of a philosophical framework?
No, he actually gets pretty specific. He lays out a detailed blueprint for how this ethical state would function. I mean, he tackles everything, from the structure of government to the role of technology in this new society.
Okay, so let's dive into the nuts and bolts of his proposal then. Where does he even begin with something as massive as redesigning society?
Well, he starts with a constitution for the ethical state. He sees it as kind of like the foundational document, the guiding principles that would shape this new society.
So like the 10 Commandments of the ethical state.
Yeah, kind of. But instead of, thou shalt not steal, it's more like principles of awareness, ethical decision-making, and a commitment to the common good.
Okay, so what are some of the big ideas he outlines in this constitution?
Well, one of the most striking things about it is his emphasis on individual freedom. He's not talking about some kind of authoritarian regime where everyone's forced to conform to a rigid set of rules. He believes that individuals should have the maximum amount of liberty possible.
Maximum liberty. So it's kind of a libertarian streak in his thinking.
In a way, yes. But there's a crucial caveat. He also recognizes that, freedom without responsibility, it can easily devolve into chaos.
Right. It's like that old saying, your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins.
Exactly. Garcia argues that true freedom comes with a sense of responsibility for our actions and their impact on others. That's where the concept of ethical decision-making becomes so important. It's about recognizing that our choices have consequences, both for ourselves and for those around us.
So it's not just about doing whatever you want, whenever you want. It's about making choices that are in alignment with this broader goal of increasing awareness and promoting the well-being of all.
Precisely. It's about finding that balance between individual freedom and social responsibility. And to help maintain that balance, Garcia proposes a really unique system of governance.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because if we're talking about creating a truly ethical society, then the way we govern ourselves is critical.
Absolutely. And Garcia, he's not afraid to challenge conventional thinking here. He doesn't believe that democracy, as it's currently practiced in most parts of the world, is the best way to achieve this vision of an ethical state.
So he's not a fan of, pure majority rule. He thinks there needs to be more to it than that.
He does. He argues that in a true ethical state, leadership needs to be based on merit, not just popularity or political maneuvering.
So not just whoever can get the most votes or tell the most compelling stories.
Right. Garcia believes that leadership should be entrusted to those who have demonstrated a deep understanding of the game of life, those who have consistently made choices that increase awareness and contribute to the common good.
So he's talking about a kind of meritocracy, but one that's based on, ethical merit, not just intelligence or competence.
Exactly. It's not just about being smart or capable. It's about having a proven track record of ethical decision-making and a genuine commitment to the well-being of others.
Okay, so that makes sense in theory, but how do you actually measure something like ethical merit? Are we talking about, some kind of standardized test for morality? It sounds a little dystopian, right?
It does sound a bit like that, doesn't it? But Garcia, he anticipates that criticism. He stresses that the system wouldn't be about, assigning people a number or putting them into neat little categories based on some arbitrary test.
So it's not like a social credit score or something like that.
No, not at all. He envisions a system where individuals are constantly being evaluated based on their actions, their contributions to society, and their commitment to ethical principles.
So it's more about ongoing assessment based on real-world actions and contributions, not just some snapshot of their moral character at one point in time.
Exactly. It's about recognizing and rewarding individuals who consistently demonstrate, wisdom, ethical conduct, a genuine commitment to making the world a better place. And to further guard against, the pitfalls of power, Garcia proposes a really unique feature for the ethical state, a dual leadership structure.
Okay, this is where his thinking takes a really interesting turn. A dual leadership structure. What does that even look like in practice? We're talking about co-presidents?
Yeah.
Two people sharing every single position of power.
You got it. Well, almost Garcia envisions every leadership position from the very top, even the president, all the way down to, mayors and local officials. Every single one would be filled by a pair, one man and one woman.
Wow. Okay, so every decision, every policy, every law, it would have to be made with input and agreement from both a male and a female perspective. That's a pretty radical departure from, pretty much every system of government in the world today.
It is, and it might sound a little strange at first, but Garcia, he believes that this balance is absolutely essential for creating a truly ethical and effective government.
Okay, so it's not just about, representation or fairness, although those things are obviously important. He's saying that this dual leadership structure would actually lead to better decision-making overall.
Exactly. He argues that having both a male and a female perspective in positions of power would help to prevent the kind of tunnel vision or groupthink that can often plague single-leader systems. When everyone's coming from a similar background, similar experiences, it's easy to get stuck in a rut.
Right, you get those echo chambers where everyone's just reinforcing each other's biases.
Yeah.
So Garcia's saying that by having this built-in diversity of thought, this constant dialogue between different perspectives, it forces leaders to think more critically, to consider a wider range of options, and ultimately to make more informed and ethical decisions.
Precisely. And Garcia, he even draws on those traditional, I guess you could say traditional notions of masculine and feminine strengths here.
Oh, okay. This is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because we want to be careful about, you know, not falling back on stereotypes.
Hmm.
But I'm curious to hear how Garcia addresses this.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. He argues that, traditionally women have often seen as better at fostering, social morality.
Yeah.
Things like nurturing, empathy, community building, right?
Those kind of caretaking and collaborative
Yeah,
skills.
exactly. While men, they've often been associated with like personal morality, so more focus on individual growth, exploration, pushing boundaries. And again, he's not saying these are inherent qualities of all men or all women, but rather these kind of archetypal energies that he's observed throughout history.
Right, like those classic yin and yang energies constantly
Mhm.
interacting and balancing each other out.
Precisely. And Garcia believes that by intentionally bringing those two energies into positions of power, it creates a more holistic and ultimately a more effective approach to leadership.
That's a fascinating concept. And it definitely sparks a lot of questions about, how those traditional roles might evolve in a truly equitable society.
Hmm.
But within this framework of the ethical state, Garcia seems to be suggesting that those differences, when balanced correctly, can actually lead to better outcomes for everyone.
That's the core of his argument. He believes that men and women, they each bring unique strengths to the table, and that by working together collaboratively, we can create a more just and compassionate world. But this idea of dual leadership, it's really just one piece of the puzzle, right? Garcia, he outlines a whole system designed to support this ethical state. And that includes addressing things like, resource allocation, economic policy, even the role of technology in this new society.
Okay, so let's talk about technology for a second, because Garcia, he's not exactly a techno-utopian. He's very aware of the potential dangers of things like, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering. But at the same time, he doesn't shy away from those technologies completely, does he?
Not at all. He actually believes that technology, when guided by ethical principles, it can be a powerful tool for good. He sees the potential for technology to help us overcome some of our biggest challenges, to expand our awareness, and to create a more just and sustainable world.
So it's not about rejecting technology outright. It's about ensuring that it's developed and used responsibly within a framework of ethics and awareness.
Exactly. And Garcia believes that the ethical state provides that framework. It's about creating a society where technological advancements are guided by a deep understanding of their potential impact on humanity and the planet.
So it's a more nuanced and, I guess, a more hopeful view of technology than we often hear these days.
It is, and it speaks to Garcia's overall optimism, I think. He truly believes that a better world is possible. But he also acknowledges that it's not going to be easy. Getting from where we are now to this vision of an ethical state, well, it's going to require a monumental effort.
So where do we even begin? Does Garcia offer any guidance on how we might actually start to make this transition?
He does. And it all comes back to those protagonists we talked about earlier. He argues that it's up to these highly aware individuals to not only embody the principles of the ethical state in their own lives, but to actively work towards its realization.
So it's not about waiting for some mass awakening or hoping that, the powers that be will suddenly see the light. It's about taking concrete action right now, today, to start building this new world.
Exactly. Garcia, he's all about action. He outlines a very strategic approach for these protagonists, suggesting they use their influence, their resources, even their wealth to create systems of support for like-minded individuals.
So we're talking about like funding research, starting businesses, creating educational programs, really anything that helps to promote ethical decision-making and expand awareness.
Exactly. He also encourages them to challenge the existing power structures, to push for reforms that align with the principles of the ethical state. He sees it as a gradual process, right, of shifting the Overton window, changing the conversation, and gradually moving society in a more ethical direction.
It's a long game, for sure. But I think it's a hopeful vision, too. It reminds us that we're not just passive bystanders in this grand experiment of civilization. We have the power to shape the future, to create a world that reflects our highest values.
Absolutely. And that's the enduring message of Garcia's work, I think. He forces us to confront these big questions, to examine our own lives, our choices, and to ask ourselves what role we want to play in shaping the future. Are we content to just go with the flow? Or are we willing to step up and become those protagonists, those agents of change that he talks about?
It's a powerful question, and one that I think will stay with our listeners long after this deep dive. So until next time, Keep those minds expanding. And remember, the future is not something that just happens to us. It's
Of
something
course.
we create.